Thank you, Mrs. Porter. I'm going to start. And yes, I'm Scott Newman. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here today. We want to try to synthesize a lot of materials that have come into your box lately. Before we get into the finances, though, my mom taught me growing up that it's never too late to say thank you. And so what I wanted to recognize is that although Veterans Day was yesterday, I'm sitting next to two veterans here at Smith Ranch Homes. We have a number of resident veterans. We also have some employee veterans. And I just wanted to recognize our resident and staff veterans and thank you for your service and happy Veterans Day and thank you for what you've done. Are there any other veterans in the audience that would like to acknowledge themselves? Thank you, gentlemen and ladies, if you're there. Okay, excellent. Well, thank you very much. What we wanted to do today is kind of talk about the budget process and also the results. And what I brought was one of three binders that I have in my office. And these are the binders that I have that have accumulated all the budget materials that we've been developing over the last few months. And once the budget is approved, we consolidate 3 binders worth of information into a beautifully packaged 45-page document that we gave to you on Friday in your cubby box. Now there's going to be an exam on page 37 and 41, but half of this is statutorily required. We have to give this to you. And a lot of it is policy information, but there's also a lot of important financial information. But we know that this is a pretty big cross to bear, so we try to consolidate that into a 20-slide PowerPoint presentation, but also consolidate it into a 3-page handout that you have today. I wouldn't say let's follow along the slideshow in this page. This is really something as a bit of a parting gift, if you will. This will be something for you to refer to now, maybe later. And if you're at home watching this, please know that this handout's available on our website under our financial documents. And this PowerPoint presentation is also on our website. We're recording this presentation as well, so we're going to replay this over the weekend, and we'll give you some times on that. So don't feel like you need to sit down and feverishly write down notes. We'd love you to, but don't feel that you won't have this information to refer to later. But at the end, we'll give you some contact information because I hope there's some feedback from you that you'd like to provide or some questions. So because of technology, I'm going to be changing a little bit. This is not a PowerPoint presentation where I can just click a slide. I'm actually going to be manually adjusting some things. So I'm going to get up here, and I'm hoping I don't feedback. Let's see. Okay. So with our PowerPoint today, I'm going to warm up the crowd. That was my job. So I'm hoping everybody is warming up. And then we're going to get into the actual PowerPoint. And we're going to talk about a summary of our 2025 assessments. We have a unit assessment and a dining assessment. We wanted to go by department and show you where the changes are occurring. We also want to identify the key drivers of what's moving your assessment in certain directions. And then we also want to identify what's the history of our assessments at Smith Ranch Homes, but also how does it affect your cash flow? We spend a lot of times talking about percentages, but how about the dollar amounts? And how does it affect you on a monthly cash flow basis? And then we are going to spend some time talking about the reserve program at Smith Ranch, and also how your assessment is really allocated by your dollar. What does your dollar go to on a monthly basis? So now that you're warmed up and ready to go, Cliff drew the next straw, where he's going to take it from here and identify his finance committee team and how they tackled the budget this year.
I think I got that on. And I'm going to stand up, and I like to talk with my hands a lot, so I also brought a little pointer along so that I can point at things. But this year, as chair of the Finance Committee, I've had a very good committee working with me, with Jerry Lewis, who's our vice chair, Bruce Morris is our secretary, Mike Adutson is a member, Ian Leverton, Leah Neeson, and Greer Goldman was also a member for a period of time, but she had to resign for some personal reasons. She felt she could just not devote enough time to the committee. But I do want to thank those members. They have been very helpful, always raising good questions and good insights as we move along on this budget process. The budget process started back in June, ended up in October with the final composite. But we spent a lot of time on it, and some of you may know that the Finance Committee has a reputation of having meetings that go about 4 hours or more. So there's a lot to go over. So our budget preparation strategy, the first thing I want to talk about is this one. We talk about a zero-based budget strategy. That isn't, when you look at the financials and come to the bottom line and it's zero, that what we mean is that we, we'll come back to that.
We're good. Go, take it away, Cliff.
Every account that the manager has responsibility for, they start with a zero amount at the beginning of the budget cycle, and then they work back up as to what do I need for, to meet my goals as the manager, what expenses do I have to incur, what do I need, what don't I need? So this is an example of one account. This is account number 706560, supplies small tools under the administration department. And we look at probably 100 of these accounts. And there's a lot of detail. For 21, 22, 23, you can see the budget and the actual expenditures. Then you can see where we are through August 31st. We spent $9,600, what the average is. And then the managers work and put this together. Comparison to 24, but they say, okay, and look back at what they spent. This is what the manager feels they need to spend out of that account for this year, and then there's some information here as to what they are. So, I mean, it's a detailed process. It's not just something we say, okay, the 24 budget was 11,000, let's just increase that by 10% and we're done. We don't do it that way. We go back to the beginning and start over. So that's what we mean by zero-based budget. Item 2, next one, maintain a reasonable assessment for residents relative to the practical cost of living, the increase in living costs each year, while providing the services and amenities requested, desired by our residents. We try to keep that in perspective. And then last one is to provide a thorough cost, funding, and component schedule analysis of our reserves. We spend a fair amount of time on that. We work with maintenance committee and with Scott to review our reserves, and we'll come to that a little bit later today. So, next slide. So a little bit of humor. So one of our residents was sitting around the other day and she said, I grew up with Steve Jobs, Johnny Cash, and Bob Hope. Now there's no Cash, no Hope, and no Jobs. Please don't let anything happen to Kevin Bacon. So, a little humor before we get into more serious things.
Thanks, Cliff. I should have started with that to warm up the crowd. Thank you. So we are going to transition over to Gary now, and you're going to jump in and explain the assessment detail. So Gary, take it away.
I'm going to just try sitting down and doing it. The first visual, you don't need to have anything to point at, there's only one number there. So we have, as you know, two monthly assessments. We have the dining assessment and we have the operating assessment or the regular assessment. And so we go into, in the budgeting process, we go into each one different, separately, and then combine them at the end. So for the regular assessment, we have managed to get under 7% slightly, 6.94% increase over the past year, which sounds like quite a bit, but considering the inflationary effect of labor and food, I think it's quite an accomplishment. So the way you see that is through an assessment, monthly assessment. The assessment schedule is included in one of the pages in your budget handout. So if you want to look at the detail afterward, you can do that.
I hear a lot of paper shuffling here. I just want to say, the materials that we gave to you on Friday, that's page 6 of 42, not in your hands today of what we gave. But please go home and maybe mark that page to refer to.
So there are actually 68 different charge codes for the assessment. And the assessment is based on the combination of per capita and by square footage. And the result of that is the assessment schedule. And what we have here are some samples of different size units, some combined units, and then the villas, some examples of those. And what you're seeing there is the change in terms of dollars. For instance, the number 1 is $190 a month increase. For number 14, it's $272 increase. But the one thing that's the same is that it's 6.94% for each one. So everybody gets the same increase, and the larger units pay more, as they should. So if we can look at the where that assessment, how that breaks down. So we're still talking about the regular assessment. So we have 9.3 million of departmental expenses. And then we have 1.5 million that we put into the reserve account this coming year. So that equals 10.8 million, that's what we need to fund. Part of that funding, about 200,000, comes from ancillary revenue, such as the guest rooms and things that we charge extra for when you ask for them for those services. So we subtract that, and we end up slightly less, 10.6 million for the owner assessment. Then we go to the dining. Dining, we're only up 2.5% this coming year, the budget. We are using a 300-person census for dining versus 299 last year, so there's a slight benefit there. And this is just a budget figure, so we don't control what actually happens with the census. But we feel pretty safe using 300. It could end up a little bit higher, maybe a little bit lower. But we feel pretty safe using that number. So the dining service fee, there are 2 basic items. There's departmental expenses, which are primarily compensation. And there's 3 million. There's 1.4 million in food and beverage costs for a total of 4.4 million. Here again, we have ancillary revenues, guest services, cocktail hour, and you know what those charges are, extra meals. So we subtract that, and we end up with 4 million, the dining for the monthly dining fee. So if we combine those two, we start off with, just using the same numbers I just showed you, we start off with 10.8 million for the operations, 4.4 million for dining, or a total of 15.2 million. This is the first time we've been over 15 million as a budget for the operation. We subtract the ancillary revenue, brings us down to 10.6 million and 4 million, or a total of 15.2 million. And that equals 0 budget break even. So we do budget to no gain, no loss, to a 0 break even each year. So the budget is, as you see, 15.2 million. So now, to get into more into the nitty-gritty, I'm going to turn it over to Scott, and he'll talk about how we developed those numbers for the departments.
Thanks, Gary. And this is probably my 10th year doing a presentation like this. And somebody before me was a board treasurer who did that for probably about 15 years before me, and he's at home, hopefully watching this. So I've said something at every one of these presentations, and this might be a good time to say it too. When we look at all these departments and adding up their total for operations, this is not a mom and pop operation. And it's an important reminder for all of us that this is a very large scale, financially operating homeowners association, where most of my peers, when I'm out at community association events, is maybe a quarter of this, if not even maybe a 16th of this. Our $15 million operating budget is a significant operation, and it's because of all the services that we look to provide you and also the staff to help provide it to you as well too. And I think it's an important reminder that there's a lot of fiduciary responsibility by not only the board, but by managers and also the finance committee. When we look at the departments, there's always a department or two that probably jumps off the map every year. And the maintenance department and administration are those two. Maintenance has a 9% increase going from $3 million to $3.4 million. And we're gonna talk about some of the key drivers, but what I would probably touch on right now is an important narrative that you're gonna hear year after year moving forward, is that this is now gonna be our 35th year of operation next year. So we're an aging campus that requires significant maintenance and repair outside of even our reserve program. Housekeeping has almost 3% increase. Resident services, by nature of the zero-based budgeting process, we saw based on our actual results, based off of what we're paying and what we're planning for next year, actually went down. So not everything goes up. Sometimes we get a little nervous if things are going down, but we do want to identify that will happen. Now it's a tick, but it is a tick nonetheless. Administration has a very large number, $2.5 million. We're going to explain that a little bit later in our key drivers. And then dining itself as an entire operation is going up 4.5%. So why isn't my unit or my meal assessment going up 4.5%? We're going to show that to you on the next slide as well. So I do have a little finger here. Cliff, I'm not going to use your pointer unless you want to come from the other side of the room, but I wanted to identify the key drivers because I think it's really important to say, out of your assessment increase or your dining service fee, there's really only a handful of items that's really pushing the pedal of why the number is the number. And when you look at what those items are, as I've said tongue-in-cheek over the years, you're not going to find a line item that says put a mini bar in Scott Newman's office. A lot of these things are just items that you know are the realities. So our regular assessment is going up 6.94% increase. I tried to find the top 5 items that were driving these numbers. First is utilities. Gas and electricity. We already know water, MMWD, PG&E with gas and electricity. They've approved rates like MMWD for the next few years and have built in some turbocharged rate increases that we're going to be experiencing. PG&E is not ever going down, so we've tuned up the gas and electricity as well too. But are we stuck with this forever? I think we need to look at consumption ideas down the road. How do we maybe reduce some of our water needs? And also down the road, gas and electricity. There are other ways to come up with electrical solutions outside of PG&E. That's where long-range planning and solar and other options could sometime address this, but right now we're paying, when you look at our financials, hundreds of thousands of dollars with utilities, and we're not under budget, so we're trying to adjust that. IT technology. Mrs. Porter mentioned that there's an action item after this meeting regarding a replacement of our accounting software, but much, much more. Our entire backbone of our operating system at Smith Ranch, from a management standpoint, needs to be replaced. But there's also a forward option that this replacement program can provide you, the residents, much more of a nice, engaging workflow, where you can maybe call your car to the valet office through a click on your mobile phone, or maybe you can order dinner much more effectively, or you can see in real time, what is my accounting of my account right now, not what was charged 3 weeks ago and you have to call Gabriella. There's so many more modern approaches that we get to find with this opportunity, but we've already explored the market and we know it's going to be a material increase to do this. We also know sometimes you need to rely on a consultant to assist you on a major decision like this, and the board's going to be addressing that consulting proposal shortly. Administration had that large number, and we've talked about earlier some management transition that's happening. In 2025, we're looking to bring a financial manager. There's some transition within executive leadership, and also down the staffing model, there's additional personnel and administration that we'd like to find. The internet services is an interesting one. It was a little painful in the month of October/November. Thank you, Monica. But not thank you, Monica, like you caused it, but thank you, Monica, for pulling us out of that. But I heard a story the other day that somebody had their Comcast bill from September, and they had internet, and they had basic TV and maybe a little extra, and they were paying about $130. And after this, maybe $139. And after the reboot of our internet option for Smith Ranch Homes, their bill is closer to about $40 right now. Now, they're still paying for that internet, but it's through the assessment, and we've been able to provide a much more cost-effective bulk option. So while your assessment is going up $100,000 community-wide, you and your cash flow should consider the balancing act where you're actually spending net less every month. And I don't want to rope-a-dope you and say, oh, you know, in the end you're spending less. But let's be considerate that sometimes Smith Ranch does try to find options to harness our purchase power and offset your monthly outflow in other mechanisms and build it into your unit assessment. Finally, property and earthquake insurance. This is going up at least projected $75,000. We have a great team of finance committee members working with strategies on how we can improve our premium cost controls and also our strategies on how we're going to insure Smith Ranch moving forward. But like it or not, at renewal time next year, we're going to expect another very large number. So taking these 5 lines, utilities, technology, management, internet services, and insurance, property insurance, of the 6.9, there's 5.5 right there before we even buy a pencil and before we even buy a hose in the maintenance department. All the other departments, housekeeping, admin, maintenance, is an extra 1.4% to get you to the 694. And I think that helps synthesize a little bit of where we're going and why the costs are the way they are. We're going to ask for questions at the end, so if some of this stuff evokes a question or two, please feel free to hold. Or if you're so excited, don't worry, you can raise your hand. We have some mics somewhere else. But I wanted to shift over to dining services because this changes a little bit. Our dining service fee is going up 2.5%. Well, before we even start the day, and most of it in the operations is either going to be labor or agency staff and cost of goods. When we work through that programming, that right there is a 4.2% increase. That's really what your assessment could have been, or your dining service fee could have been. But then, when it says insurance benefits, we mean employee medical benefits. And that's been communicated a little bit. We've made a shift in our coverages. Really didn't change any of the coverages for our employees, but the premium change was significant. So we were able to take that 4.2% increase and bring it down almost a point because of that one shift. And then the increased census, by having another person that we're budgeting for to pay into their meal plan, that's just more slices of the pie that's paying into the program that lightens your liability. So with an extra person, maybe you need to buy some more food, don't get me wrong, but that actually brings down more of the share allowed to everybody else. That actually brought your assessment from the 4.2 down to 2.9. But wait, there's more. We continued on through the zero-based budgeting approach. Hey, Danielle and team, we know that you're asking for A, B, and C, but the paperwork's saying you're really spending X, Y, and Z. Go back and maybe take a look. And maybe they came back with the same number, or they said, you know, there is an option to reduce some more costs. And that's where we ended up getting to our 253. I'm going to turn it to Gary because, again, percentages, we're overloading everybody with numbers, but I think it is important to look back in the last 5 years to see what our assessments were looking like.
Okay, thank you, Scott. So what we have here is since every floor plan size has a different monthly fee, slightly different monthly fee, we just picked sort of an average one as an example. So this is a floor plan 7. And so what you see here, going back to 2021, you can see that the increase has been around 5 or 6%, except for 2023 when it was 12% increase. And you may recall that was right after the COVID epidemic, and there was a lot of catching up to do. We had supply chain issues, everything became more expensive, we had labor issues, people didn't want to work anymore, and it was a very difficult year. And we've highlighted that one in yellow because that was really outside the ordinary. We feel like we're back into the normal range now, under 7%. Same thing applies to dining services. It was very difficult to get labor during that year, and we had to increase our labor costs more than once during the year just to make sure that we were fully staffed. Not to mention that food prices went up a lot that year also. But if you look at the other years, well, 2022 was 5%, but the other years are down to the 1% and 2% increase. So from that standpoint, if you just take away 2023, it's looking very good for dining.
And that's not a typo in 21. The dining service fee actually went down 1.25%. So we really just allocate and assess based off of what our true cash expectation need is.
So how does this affect each of us individually? So we have what we call the cash flow effect. So, okay, as you know, you get charged on two bases each month, on the operations assessment and then on the dining fee. So here again, since every unit is a little bit different, we've gone back to floor plan 7 as an example. So this is the first top of the page is floor plan 7 with a single occupant. So you'll see their monthly unit assessment went from 3.3 thousand to almost 3,600, a monthly increase of $233. And if you multiply that times 12, it's close to $2,800 a year. The dining fee is the same for everybody, and that went from just up $27 on a monthly basis, or $324 for the year. So the total then is $3,120, or a 5.87% increase. Now that's lower than the 6.92 that I showed you earlier, because that's a combination. This is a combination of dining and operations. So we're looking at, in this example, Unit 7, we're looking at a 5.87% combined increase. Then let's take another example. Here's a floor plan A2 villa with a couple living there. Here you see that their unit assessment went from $4,300 to $4,600, or a $300 increase, to a total of $36. The dining fee went up, not $27, but $54, because there's two of them with the dining fee. And so you'll see a total there of annualized increase of $4,284, or 5.47%. It's a little bit lower increase than this top one because there's two dining fees instead of one. So that's the example of the combined effect of the dining and the operations. Now, I would like to complicate things. So we have a complicated speaker talking about a complicated subject. We're going to talk about, Cliff is going to talk about the reserve account.
Yeah, unfortunately, I always loved numbers. You know, that's why I got into this business 50 years ago, but still like numbers. A couple of things I just want to also highlight. You know, the budget process, and we get into reserves here. Those numbers are estimates, they're projections. They're the best that we can do based on where we are today when we make those numbers. It's no guarantee that we're going to hit those numbers. We may spend more money than we budgeted, we may spend less, but it is an estimate, so keep that in mind. And also earlier, yesterday or the end of last week, Jerry Lewis forwarded to me a little note that he saw in the Wall Street Journal that said homeowners associations and other common interest realty associations, such as condominiums and cooperatives, are all experiencing higher increases in their operating expenses than had been incurred in the years prior. Pointed out in the article, of course, a couple of things. One was rising costs for utilities insurance, and properties are aging. And as they age, it does cost more money to maintain them. So again, I just wanted to emphasize that point. So on reserves, reserves are the second largest expenditure from our operations outside of wages and employee benefits. The next largest expense is reserves, and you'll see that a little bit later. More so than utilities and insurance, which are the next two largest single item expenditures. So on our reserve study, and we'll flip to, why don't you go to that big Excel schedule. So on reserves, we have components of our property listed. We have 260 individual line items on the schedule. So it's a huge number. And each line item has the year it was placed in service, estimated useful life, estimated remaining useful life, and the current cost of the component. That's the current cost, not the future cost, but it's our estimate of what this year's cost will be to replace it. So if we look at, what do we want to pick here? Something simple.
Took us a while to find something simple.
Okay, roofs are not all that simple, but in 2008, we replaced the phase one of the roofs, and this was for, I think, the condos. So 2008 had a 40-year estimated useful life, 23 years are remaining on that life, and the current cost is $1,923,000, so not small. To get this number, Civil Code 5570 funding, that's also called fully funded number. And how you get to that is real simple. You take 23, divide it by 40, multiply it by $1,000,009, and that's what you come up with, which represents how much of our, how much of the life has eroded to date. How much is it deteriorated to date? Actually, I didn't quite say that right. No, it's actually 40 minus 23 gives us 17. So 17 divided by 40 times that number will give you that number.
And I think the essence is, for the scholars at home, for us to be fully funded, which is a phrase that goes around, the statute says you should have $817,000 in your reserves today to be able to say you are fully funded in that component. And we would apply that concept all the way down, which you may get to shortly.
Let's do that.
Let's do it now. Right now. Okay, let's go down.
So we compute this for every component. Excel helps out, but we compute that for every single component. So it says that the total cost, current cost of all these components is $33 million. The fully funded amount is $16 million, but we only have, at the end of 2005, we'll only have, our projection is we'll have $2.4 million. So 2.4 million divided by 16 million says we are 15.3% funded. Now, a number of folks over the years say, geez, I don't know if that's the right number, but I will tell you, the Finance Committee has looked at this in some detail. When I got on the committee, we were we took a baseline funding approach. So for HOAs, there are 3 funding goals to consider. One is baseline, which says we don't want to drop below 0 in our funds. Threshold funding says we're going to pick a number, either a dollar number or a % number, and that's what we're going to shoot for. or the third one is fully funded. We're gonna shoot to be fully funded. So for us to be fully funded, we would have to contribute approximately $14 million more today to be fully funded. We, the committee, and I think the board has agreed, we don't think that's the proper approach. We think we should be prudent in our funding, and we'll show you a schedule here in a minute, and let our residents retain their funds rather than doing a special assessment to increase our funding level. So we'll move to the, I should tell you, by the way, jump back to that one. This schedule goes out for 30 years over here. And so every year, Scott totaling what's gonna be spent in current dollars for that year. And you'll see that when we get to the next schedule. And before we leave that, I just wanna add one other thing. In the packet that we handed out on Friday, page 16 of 42 shows another number. And it shows that on these components, the component cost is listed at 45 million. The difference between the,
Well, I went to the 45.
oh, here's the 45 million. So some of the components are gonna be replaced 2 or 3 times over the next 30 years, not just once. So that's why this number, 45 million, is considerably greater than the 23 million you saw earlier. Did I say that all right?
I think you said 2005 once, and you meant to say 2025.
Oh,
And here is
2025.
32 million versus 23. He does this to me all the time when I'm at a finance meeting, so now I get to do this.
All right, so this isn't a summary schedule. So this number, total expense, comes from that other schedule. So we are projecting in 2025, we're gonna spend $1.5 million on our components that need to be replaced, refurbished, updated in 2025. In 2026, current dollars spent will be $825. Now, the next thing is that we take and inflate those as we go forward. So this is a compounding rate of inflation. The inflation factor is 2.75. The Finance Committee looks at this every single year and says, is that the right assumption? Should we change that? So we discuss that every year. The next one is, so moving across on our schedule, is the inflated current expenditure. So it's the total expense from that big spreadsheet you saw, multiplied by an inflation factor to get to the total current expenditure. Here is the reserve contribution, which is coming in at 2.5% this year and continuing at 2.5 every year for the next 5 years.
10 years.
Huh?
Through the decade. Yeah.
Through the decade.
2030.
And then at 2031, we changed that to a 2.75?
Yep.
Is that what we're doing? 2.75. So that's where that number comes from. Investment income. So the committee looks at investment income and makes an assumption. What's our rate gonna be this year, next year, future years? So for this year, 2025, we're estimating that this is 4% net of tax. We pay tax on our net investment income. That tax rate, including federal and state, is 26%. Okay? There's a lot of stuff. But that's how that number comes from. So we take what we've got in cash, we estimate what it's gonna return for investment, and then there's our total reserve balance. When I mentioned threshold funding, our threshold says we want to end up at the end of each year at least $1.5 million. And you can see that we are doing that as we go down this list. Some years we have a significant balance, some years it gets smaller. And the committee looks at this again every year, and we adjust it as we think is prudent and necessary so that we meet that threshold goal.
Cliff, I might add, we actually are adjusting it 175 at 2030, because one of the things that the Finance Committee wanted to look at is equitability over 30 years. So when we look across the 30-year time horizon, do we see a steady increase of reserve contributions from residents? So you're enjoying replacement funding that was given to the reserves years ago by your predecessors, and we want to continue to give, but in times past, maybe we've seen some top-heavy or bottom-heavy years, where maybe people in the next 10 years are contributing at a higher rate, much more than the people later on. And we've kind of diffused that a little bit so there's a steady increase throughout, but steadily increasing as well. Do you want to jump back to the slideshow, Cliff? Or
Yeah. So I think we can move to our next item on our reserves. So, as Scott said, for 2025 through 2030, our reserve contribution is gonna go up 2.5% each year. And then from 2031 through 2054, we're at a 2% increase. And again, we look at that every year. So it will change, maybe not every year, but it will change as we go forward. So for 2025, our new contribution to reserves, which represents 14% of our total expenditures, is $1.5 million, or $38,000 greater than 2024, which is 2.5% of what it was in 2024. So these again are the assumptions. We have adopted threshold funding at 1.5 million. As it notes there, it can be breached, but only with approval from the board. As an example, 2 years ago, we did the re-roofing of the villas. It was planned for 2 phases, one phase in 2023 and the second in 2024. We got an offer from the contractor that he would discount his price if we did it all in 1 year. The board agreed to that, but that caused us to drop below the 1.5 million. But what happened is that expenditures were planned for 2024, got spent in 2023, but we realized the savings. I don't know, what was it, 25,000 or something?
Significant.
It was significant. And so these are the other assumptions. And again, we look at these each year. So for 2025, our current rough interest rate on our investments is 5.5%. At 75% of that amount being after tax, we're at 4%. We're estimating that for the next years, we're at 3% after tax. And this is our inflation factor that we're using when we inflate the current expenditures. All right, next. So, again, estimated balance at the end of this year, in another month and a half, what's what we estimate will be in our reserve funds. These are our contributions that have been agreed to. That's again, 2.5% increase from 24. This is our estimated investment income. Our total then will be $4,017,000. We are expected to spend, and we'll show you that in a second, $1.5 million, and then our ending balance at 12/31/25 is 2.4 million. Again, 15.3% funded. So, as a percentage of fully funded, okay. So, these are some of the items which will be, we estimate will be incurred in next year, 2025. The handouts that you've got coming in has the complete list of all, whatever it is, 36 components. Some are small, some are major. A couple of things to note. Thermostat controls. We had originally estimated that reserve expense would be about $250,000. Now, over the 2 years, it's closer to $450,000. So that is a significant increase from prior. Guest rooms, we have this in our reserves, but not at this price. So $70,000 is a guess as to what the expenses will be necessary to improve one of the guest rooms so it is more wheelchair friendly.
And then in 2026, there's something scheduled in our reserves for guest rooms A and C to be more we're not calling it ADA, but I think we called it accessibility friendly, just to try to improve those elements as well too.
Good. Next one, fire alarm, and I think everybody is aware that we've had some problems with that. The red switches in the units are not always gonna be, reliable, there's the term, reliable. We are looking at alternatives, so for this next year, we've put in a placeholder, a study of $50,000 to study what are the other options, because rewiring what we have, it would be very expensive. Scott, you want?
No, I think it's important for us to identify, we're proactively putting some money in place so that we can find a solution, whatever that may be, and there's a lot of more modernized approaches that we could consider.
And the last highlighted is the interior design. We have set aside $35,000 to engage an interior designer to help with the process of starting the remodel of the common areas of the condominium buildings. So including carpeting, painting or wall covering, and furniture. So the architectural committee is working on that, and we'll be interviewing, and then our anticipation is engaging an interior design consultant who will be with us for some years to help with that process. So I think that's it for the major one. Now, it's Scott's turn.
Okay, and let me just add one thing here before we go to that. I've heard it mentioned once or twice that, gee, if we had more money in the reserve account, maybe we wouldn't have had such a large special assessment. That's not true. The reserve account is to account for wear and tear, normal wear and tear, and useful life of our facilities, not for casualty loss. And to the extent that we can, we have insurance for casualty loss, but when dealing with water issues, that's very hard to come by. So no matter what was in our reserve account, we still would have had to fund the casualty losses in the Villa water issue. I just wanted to make that clear.
And we did lean on reserves temporarily for some working capital, but there is a requirement by the state, not by Smith Ranch Homes, that if you borrow from reserves, you have to pay it back to reserves as well. And we have done that clean and clear.
Actually, let me add just one more thing on the reserve. Some folks have asked questions about the deductibility of the special assessment. We are going to be sending out a written notice, and it will go in the cubby with some general information on that. The one thing that I just wanted to emphasize, for it to be included in 2024 tax return, the special assessment has to be paid. So it can't be accrued if people are paying it over a couple of months. So to get the full deductibility, or the possible full deductibility, it needs to be paid in this year. And that's it. But if you have any questions, please ask me. I'll try to answer.
Just to wrap this up, I see that it's approaching 3 o'clock, and I think we blew through our 20 minutes 40 minutes ago. But really what we wanted to identify was, where is your dollar going? For every dollar you spend on your bill, this is combining unit assessment operations, housekeeping, admin, maintenance, and resident services, plus dining services. You can see some large segments here that are notable. 28% goes to the wages. And I recognize I'm an employee saying this, but when you add wages plus taxes and workers' comp plus benefits, this is almost 35%, or 35 cents of your dollar is going towards staffing. But I also think that's part of the signature of Smith Ranch Homes. We have considered robots someday, but we recognize the staffing is an important element of Smith Ranch, but particularly living in 2024 in California, and Marin County has brought on challenges of getting a wage that can command a full staff. When we look at some other big tickets, and Cliff touched on it earlier, 14 cents of your reserve fund is going, or 14% is going to reserve contributions. And then we see utilities down here too. So there's a lot of housekeeping other, maintenance other, admin other, But when you look at utilities, we'll include patrol and valet. That contract is a major part. Insurance is growing. It never was approaching 10%, but it has been steadily increasing and getting to 10%. But then also the employee side is a third of your pie right there. So I do want to open it up for some questions, but I do want to recognize that, oh, dining services team, sorry, look at this. I thought this was combined, so shame on me. I've been doing this for 10 years, I said. But when we shift to dining services, I think it's even more pronounced when we look at the wage command for our staffing. Wages, just pure compensation, 45%. Add in the taxes and benefits, you're now over 50% going towards staffing. And we recognize that's part of the cost of doing business. And we'd like to try to control those costs as best we can, but it is a tough hill to eliminate those. Finally, if you have some questions later on, I'm last in this list. So Gary would be happy to hear from you. If Gary's not home, Cliff is a good backup, but I'm always here too. But we do want to hear from you, phone, email, or whatever, today or later. We want this to be an engaging process, but also transparent, and we want to be held accountable later on with how we achieve the numbers. So Monica and Sarah, I think you have some microphones. Are there any questions from the audience about any slides to go over again, or anything emerged that you'd like some clarification? Mr. Bertelson, mic is coming from Sarah.
My compliments to the entire team for an enormous amount of work on the budget and the reserve study. That's extraordinary. I have a compliment again. That this year we're trying to reduce our costs, and one of the ways you're doing that on insurance is increasing the deductible. And as I understand it, that you're also going to build into the reserve study a funding for that going further at risk. So I think that's very conservative and quite appropriate and imaginative in my part. Now my question is, and just looking at the screen, the minimum of $1.5 million was set last year, and then Cliff, you then went through the projections for the next maybe 30 years, whatever, and compared that to the $1.5 million. Wouldn't it be more rational to increase the threshold by the same factor or a higher for inflation, to increase the threshold?
Am I on?
You're on, it takes a second.
So, we've looked at that in one of the reasons that we set it at 1.5 million was that we were close to 15 million of total expense, and we thought 10% of what we expend was a reasonable approach to that number. And we were gonna look at it periodically, but maybe not every year. But as that expenditure number grows, which it will, we were looking at setting our threshold at roughly 10% of that expenditure. We thought that was a reasonable approach to arrive at a threshold funding amount.
So our operating budget is $15 million. That's what's driving the $1.5 million baseline in reserves. At some point very soon, we're going to be at $20 million. And at that point, we would probably shift the baseline to being $2 million year over year. And then every hurdle that we get to, because not every year, I don't think, if you keep changing too many goalposts, it could be getting a little challenging. But I think at some point we want to be strategic and address what is our threshold baseline. But I think we've been looking at it as every 5 million increase of our operating budget will adjust the reserve funding threshold.
Let me also say that we have the investment income aspect too. So that's reflective of inflation too. So the investment income will go up each year as well. And if we include investment income and what you were suggesting, we would end up before too many more years with a rather large amount in the reserve account. And that raises the question that we ask ourselves at the beginning, and that is, how much of your money do you want to have tied up with Smith Ranch, or how much do you want to be able to invest it yourself, as long as you know that we have a reasonable reserve going forward?
But these are good questions, and I think it's been identified that coming over the next few weeks, months, whatever, we want to engage the board, we want to engage the finance committee and other entities on these concerns and questions, because education is important, but also new ideas are important too. So I think we're committed to doing that over the course of the next year. Good question. Any others? Speechless. Well, thank you very much. Again, all of this information is going to be on the website. You have some takeaways, but please contact us if you have any questions, and we're going to continue to update you on our funding plan as we go throughout 2025. Thanks, team.